Okay, good evening. I'm Jane Healy, and on behalf of Siouxland Libraries, I'd like to thank you for joining us here tonight, and those of you taking part online. Those of you who are here, you'll see on the back table, there's some summer reading challenge cards. Yes, we have summer reading for all ages. So if you're going to be doing a lot of reading, and I know you do, pick one up. You might as well win a prize for what you're already doing. We also have, if you're not receiving our e-newsletter, you're going to want to sign up for that so that you know other events that are coming up. So please do that if you haven't. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to let you know about our next author visit, which will be here or online on Thursday, June 10th at 6:30. Co-authors Cindy Bahi and Mike Henriksen, who you might know as a sportscaster for Dakota News Now, will share some of the stories found in their book, Genuine Journeys of Life. You can register on our website or give us a call for that. For those attending online, please keep your mics muted unless you're asking a question, and then please mute it right away again. We'll have a Q&A time at the end, but it might just be simpler for you to type in your questions, and I'll monitor that and get the questions to our speaker. If anyone has technical difficulties at home, please call 605-367-8700, and I'll put that number in the chat too so you can see it there. Finally, what we're here for, we are honored to have with us tonight Dr. David Wolff, Professor Emeritus at Black Hills State University. He specialized in South Dakota and Black Hills history and was called back to teach that this summer, and served as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Wolff is a member of several historical societies and serves on the Board of Trustees for the South Dakota Historical Society and as chair of Deadwood's Adams Museum and House Board of Directors. He has received a number of awards, including Black Hills State University's Distinguished Faculty Member Award for 2010 and the Mining History Association's Rodman Paul Award for Outstanding Contributions to Mining History in 2012. He's here to talk to us tonight about his third book, The Savior of Deadwood, James K.P. Miller on the Gold Frontier, which is just off the press from South Dakota State Historical Society. The library has ordered a copy, but it's so new, it's not even here yet. So when it does, you can put it on hold, but we do have some for sale here tonight after the talk. Again, we'll have time for questions at the end, and he'll be happy to sell and sign books after that. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Wolff.
Thank you, Jane, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here on this lovely Sioux Falls afternoon. It was a great drive across the state of South Dakota today, and it's a lovely, lovely state this time of the year. All the greenness out there, you just can't beat it. I just got this book finished, and it was just off the press, I should say. And I'm not really here to sell it, and I'll be happy to sell you one. I'm a terrible salesperson. I don't try to be a huckster. I don't want to push books. But if you want to buy one, I'll sell them. They're listed at $29.95, and I'll sell them to you for $25. But when you write a book, you like to talk about it, make people aware of it, and maybe people want to look at it sometimes. So I like to do that. And this book I wrote about James K.P. Miller. So we're going to talk about Miller, kind of hit some of the highlights of his career today through this talk about the boom and bust of Deadwood and one man's fight to save the town. And this is the one man, the Savior of Deadwood, as the title of the book says, James K.P. Miller. Let's, oops, there's Miller. It's interesting, James K.P. Miller, the Savior of Deadwood. And I bet you none of you have ever heard of him. Well, maybe one has heard of him. But, you hear of Harris Franklin, the Franklin Hotel. You hear of Seth Bullock, the Bullock Hotel. You hear of W. Adams, the Adams Museum and the Adams House. Those people are all book worthy. In fact, I wrote a book on Seth Bullock some years ago. And, but Miller, nobody's heard of Miller. Why does he deserve a book? Why does he get to be called the Savior of Deadwood? Now, I didn't call him the Savior of Deadwood. People back in the press, back in the day, called him that at one point in his career, and we'll hopefully remember to mention at what point he was called the Savior of Deadwood. This is Miller as an adult, and we'll try to take a progression through his life and talk about how he saved Deadwood. Now, to give a little background to make you aware, if you know Deadwood at all, maybe you remember this building. This was the corner of Main and Lee Street. It was the syndicate block, built in 1888 by Miller, by his syndicate. And most famously, it was the syndicate block that burned down in 1987, which then the people of Deadwood used in their campaign, in the You Bet campaign, to get gambling legalized. They used this very effectively, saying, vote for gaming while before the rest of Deadwood burns. And the people of South Dakota amended the Constitution in large part because the great syndicate block went up in flame. That was a contribution Miller made to Deadwood. Now, some of you have gone to Deadwood down the road from Boulder Canyon into Deadwood. And here it's not a very good picture. It's a little light. Is there a way to turn down the light a little bit? Along the creek side, this is Deadwood Creek, there's a black mass of rock. In fact, just a little bit further back on the road from Sturgis, there's more of this black rock. Well, that's slag. That comes out of a smelter, a gold processing. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. You can kind of see the slag up there, and that's the road to Sturgis there, and the flat spot, the slag sit spot. That came from a smelter called the Deadwood and Delaware Smelter, and that's what the Deadwood and Delaware Smelter looked like when it operated from 1891. It didn't look like this in 91, but by 1903, the smelter looked like this. This was a process. This was a building that Miller was the moving force behind it. That was his innovation in Deadwood to get this smelter operating and working, bringing gold processing to Deadwood. Now, if you really remember Deadwood in the old days, they used to have trolley car cafes. Lee had one as well. And there was a trolley, an interurban line that ran between Deadwood and Lee for a long time called the Deadwood Central. And those trolley car cafes are gone. They were put as cafes when this line closed in the late 20s. And this is a picture of one of the trolley cars. That's Miller. He did that. He put in the railroad that connected Deadwood and Lee and other railroads. So he did a lot in Deadwood, a lot we don't remember. So let's talk about Miller. Here's Miller as a young man, born in upstate New York in 1845. His initials were J.K.P. Miller. He generally went by J.K.P. His name was James Knox Polk. The 11th president of the United States had just been inaugurated. And if you know your presidents, that's James Knox Polk. So his folks named him after this Democratic president in 1845. His parents both died when he was young. As an orphan, an uncle took care of him, was impressed by Miller, impressed by his intelligence, his desire to work hard. So he bought a refinery in Buffalo, New York. Kerosene was big back then, coming on in the early 1860s. And so Miller becomes in charge as an 18-year-old of a refinery. And he writes later in life, I took reckless chances to make a great profit. And what happens? He goes broke. He lost not quite all, but most of his uncle's money. He was mortified. He was humiliated. He didn't know what to do, an 18, 19-year-old kid. So what can you do in the 1860s, particularly at the Civil War on, which you might be thinking about avoiding when you're in a tough spot? You run away. And he ran away to the West. You know, back then, people ran away to the West all the time. Escaped the Civil War, escaped marriage, escaped debt, like he did. And not only did he head west to get a restart and to redeem himself ultimately, he changed his name. For 10 years in the West, he was known as J. Sidney Osborne. And he vowed never to contact his uncle, his sisters, or anybody back home until he redeemed himself. He headed west, going to St. Joseph, got in a wagon train, and he made a vow he's going to go up to Oliver Gulch, in Virginia City, in Montana. That was the hot spot in 1863, 1864. He saw that as a place he could make a fortune and redeem himself. Well, instead of going straight up there, he takes the Oregon Trail, and he ends up in Salt Lake City. He spends a winter in Salt Lake City. And he has a little money, and he invests in little stores, smoking shops. Well, I don't know why. In a Mormon community, they don't smoke, and he invested in smoking shops. Didn't really make sense, but he tried it, and he even lost more money. And he failed a second time. And he leaves there in the spring, and he starts walking towards Virginia City, Montana. And he writes, and he kept a diary, which was published by Oklahoma Press many years ago. At this point in this part of his life, I've hit the low point of my life. I had to walk to Virginia City, had nothing to my name. I've never been lower in my life. And he hits Virginia City, and he kind of flounders until he gets hired by John S. Rockefeller, a big name in Virginia City, a good merchant. And he learned, and he worked for Rockefeller for 2 years. Rockefeller paid him well. He started getting some money ahead, and he taught him some valuable lessons. First lesson, really how to run a business. The second one is, when you run a business successfully, you diversify. Rockefeller had 3 stores, Virginia City and elsewhere. He also made the comment that you got to promote your town, get people interested and invested in your town. And he would do that. And you also got to get engaged in the town to help it improve locally. All those lessons Miller learned at Rockefeller's store. He quit there, and he ultimately went up to Helena. Helena's kind of at the top of the map up there, and that's Montana. Helena's up there. And he went there and worked for 3 years for a company called Walcott and Hearst, where he got more experience. He learned more lessons about buying goods, selling a big inventory, traveling east to buy more goods. And he made big connections. He liked to make connections. He met William Coombs-Samaro, big-time lawyer. In fact, he'd marry his daughter as his second wife later on in life. And Charles Broadwater, the great industrialist, people who would have an effect on his life later on. After he left Helena, after a few years, he moved over to Deer Lodge. Deer Lodge on the left-hand side of the map. I've had a pointer point to it. Deer Lodge. There he ran his own store for 4 years under the name Osborne and Dean. He had a partner, Dean. Osborne is still going by Osborne. And Deer Lodge he saw as the up-and-coming town. And there he applied some of the lessons he learned. He traveled back east to always buy more goods. You needed to always have a big inventory. He made connections and got credit back east. And when he wasn't back east, Dean was running the store. He then traveled to western Montana looking for customers. Very quickly, they became the biggest merchants in Deer Lodge and became fairly well off. By 1874, he decided to leave Deer Lodge. He'd been in the West 10 years under J. Sidney Osborne, learning his lessons. He decided to go home. His success in Deer Lodge allowed him to send money to his uncle, paid off his uncle, reconnected with his sisters and his family, and he heads to New York. There's Miller on the left getting ready to head to New York. Once he's in New York, one lesson he learned is he wanted a wife. He hated being lonely, so he gets married promptly. A woman who would die prematurely, but he marries her before the, anyway. And then he decides, okay, I've got to set things right. I've been 10 years in the West, established credit under the name J. Sidney Osborne. He writes a letter. He has it published in all the newspapers. He can publish it. And it's an apology letter. I spent 10 years in the West under the name of Osborne. And I didn't mean to deceive. I didn't mean to cheat. I've been honest in everything except the name. And I beg your forgiveness. I'm really James K.P. Miller. Then he takes his new bride and he heads to Minneapolis. Minneapolis is kind of, he thinks, a going town, even though this is during the Panic of 1873. In 1874, he heads to Minneapolis. Well, he gets to Minneapolis and he kind of struggles. The town isn't really thriving. 1875, the Panic of 1873 has caused hard times to hit Minneapolis, like everywhere. But in the back of his mind was what Custer had discovered in the Black Hills. In 1874, the Custer expedition had come through the Black Hills, discovered gold down by French Creek, where the town of Custer is today. The news was big, and he was living in Deer Lodge when that news got out. Gold in the Black Hills. And people from Montana were starting to head to the Black Hills. And I'm betting, although I never read it, the itch was in him. He wanted to go, but he was a merchant. He didn't want to take these obscene chances of going someplace where didn't know if it was going to stick, didn't know if there was really much gold there, could lose all his money again, and he didn't want to do that. So he watched and waited. Would this gold they discovered really pay out? So he hung out in Minneapolis until June 1876. And it took from the time Custer was there in August 1874 to June 1876 before the gold rush proved out. And then June 1876, gold started pouring out of the Black Hills. And suddenly headlines read, paying quantities of gold. And that's what you need for a gold rush to stick, to make it permanent, paying quantities. And those paying quantities were coming out of Deadwood Gulch, Deadwood, and Whitewood Creek. And Miller knew those towns that were forming up there, Deadwood especially, was the place to be. If you're going to make money in a gold rush, go to a place that's got the gold. So he finds a new partner, James McPherson in Minneapolis. They buy 8 wagons. They buy teams. This is just a random picture of wagons and teams. But buy 8 wagons and teams in Minneapolis. They head west. And they get to Deadwood August 5th, 1876, 3 days after Wild Bill is shot. And he finds the town in a turmoil. Lots of people, lots going on. Wild Bill has just been dead. The murderer Jack McCall set free. Lots of excitement. And he has to deal with this as I call him, a middle-class merchant in this new environment. How does he deal with it? What does he do? The first thing he does is take stock of the area. They start selling goods out of the wagons. They don't buy a store right away. Don't buy a building. He and his partner go up and down through all the camps, through all the towns, assessing what's going on. He's a careful observer because he wants to know, is this really going to stick? Are the prospects good for me to be a success in this town? Secondly, he knows that for a gold region like this to really develop, you need big money to develop hard rock mines. And he's got to figure out, where are these mines? Can he promote this area back east when he goes east? We bring in the more money. He also wants to figure out, where's the best place to open a store? He wants the best place, he and his partner. So he goes up and down the gulch, thoroughly inspecting what's going on. And what does he see? Well, he sees lots of violence. Now, violence, of course, is depicted in Hollywood as well out of proportion. But that period of August 1876 is ugly. People are shot in Deadwood besides Wild Bill. Native attacks are sweeping over the hills, and from August 20th to August 22nd, 1876, at least 12 whites are killed on the edge of the hills, including Preacher Smith, famously so. 3 or 4 people outside of the burgeoning town, of the young town of Rapid City. And the Indian violence would continue through 1877, not quieting down until 1878. He had to pay attention to this kind of thing. When he went back east and he tried to promote people from coming to Deadwood, that all had been in the news, and they asked about it. What about the violence in Deadwood? And he had to address it. What other things did he see? Well, there's more violence. In 1877, we start having claim jumping, and people are being shot jumping claims. And he pays attention to that because he discovers that there is wealth there, but the wealth is confined to about 6 miles of creek, the placer gold. That's it. And when you have thousands of people there, 6 miles of creek isn't much. 50, 100 people can claim it all. So violence ensues. Stagecoach robbery started September 1877 when a stagecoach driver was blown off a stage. That's big news across the country because the guy his daddy was sheriff in Laramie County, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Lots of things like that hit the news. What about population? You hear Deadwood Gulch, 10,000 people. He said, no, there weren't 10,000 people there. 1876, 2,500. He also reported in 1877, it maxed out, he said, at 5,500. 5,500. But lots of businesses. He counted 21 groceries there in 1876, 50 groceries in 1877, 53 saloons in 1876, 75 saloons in 1877. So lots of competition, hard to make a business go. But how does he avoid this? He's a guy that wants to be a middle-class businessman, make money in Deadwood. He believes, first of all, stay calm. You can't avoid it. You're there. Just stay out of it. And when he goes back and talks to people and promotes Deadwood and investment opportunities, he says, just don't go into saloons. Mind your own damn business. Stay out of the places that have trouble. You'll be fine. And he was always fine. He never got in a gunfight. He never got in trouble with Indians. And he was traveling all the time. Eventually, he and his partner find a location and open a bank and a mercantile combination, an exchange bank. His partner, McPherson, was a banker. What does an exchange bank do? You bring in your gold dust they'll give you greenbacks. Bring in your greenbacks, they'll give you gold dust. You want to sell your gold dust, they'll buy it. You want to have your gold dust shipped, they'll ship it. All for an extraordinary charge. But then that's where the money's being passed in town. So you open a mercantile next to it, and then naturally it spills over. This location is at the corner of Main and Wall Street. And that is today classified as the first row of buildings into the Badlands. All the notorious saloons were right below it. There were saloons above it, but all the notorious ones were below it. But he saw this as the best location in town. Everybody, sometime during the day in that town, went by this location. Next door, Bullock and Starr, right across Wall Street, opened their hardware store. And Saul Starr, for a time, was postmaster. If you want your mail, you came to this corner. If you wanted to exchange your gold dust, you came to this corner. If you wanted to drink heavy and find some female companionship, you went down the block. And they were at this corner. So they were at this corner from 1876 to 1879. McPherson ran the business. Miller went back, bought merchandise, heavily stocked his store. And by 1879, they had the biggest store in Deadwood, the biggest store in the Black Hills. They recorded in summer sales of 1877, $20,000 of sales a day. And you think about that, I was in retail before I became a historian. I was a pharmacist, and we were damn lucky to make $1,000 a day back in the 70s. You think 20,000 a day in 1876, 1877, phenomenal. Well, then Deadwood burned. By 1879, late 1879, September 1879, it burned. They already knew the placer gold was failing, playing out. They knew the hard rock mines were developing, but they weren't online yet, where they could have been real wealth producers. And Miller and McPherson's business burned with all the core downtown. $1.5 million damage. Miller and McPherson lost $50,000. And this brings Deadwood's first real bust. Smashed the town. It had been turning down prior to this, but this destroyed it. Some people forecast this was the end for Deadwood. McPherson, Miller's partner, packs up and leaves, as many people do. Head to Colorado. Leadville's hot. Those are the places. Aspen's hot. That's where you go. Miller stayed. And trying to figure out why he stayed, it just makes you fit the pieces together. He, one, had just moved his family there. They had just built a house on Lincoln Street. That's in the Ingleside division, right above the Adams house. It didn't burn. That part of town did not burn. So his house was still there. He had a young son, a couple years old. He said his wife just came, and his wife is pregnant. And so he doesn't really want to move. And he made money here. And he believed that even though a town burned, it can come back as a mercantile center. You know, he was in Helena. Helena had a history of burn. Helena burned 4 times in short order, and it always bounced back. So he knew Deadwood could bounce back. Plus, he was very optimistic. He knew a lot of the gold was on the Homestead Belt, but he knew there was other mineral regions around Deadwood that had not been developed. The Bald Mountain District, the Ruby Basin District, the Lena, the Iron Hill or Carbonate districts. He had faith in those, that if somehow they could be brought back to life and bring their processing business to town, bring their consumerism to town, the town can boom again. And that's his goal. He wants his town to prosper. Well, what does he do? Well, he sells his lot. He sells it to the Adams brothers, W.E. Adams and his brother. They'd been in town since 1876, of the Adams Museum fame. And they had a store further down in the Badlands. Well, they bought Miller's lot and built the Adams Brothers Grocery on Miller's old store location. This is Wall Street, Main Street. This is the Bullock Hotel. This brick building still stands. It's the corner of the Celebrity Hotel corner, if you know Deadwood, Celebrity Hotel. And Miller then moves up the street. And this is it's hanging on the wall of a business. I tried to get the owner to tell me where they got it or give me so I could get a better copy, but this is as good as it gets. The Miller Building is the tall building right there. He builds that up the street in 1888 or 1880. Pardon me. The Miller Building, and he moved up the street to near the corner, not quite on the corner of Main and Lee Streets. And he moved to that corner because he knew that's where the money was. The center of town had moved up. The center of town had relocated. Across the road or banks. We having some problems?
Yeah, it looks like the computer's about.
That computer?
Yeah.
No.
So now, so I'm in the 22.
Okay, there you go.
Oh, we need for else was doing this.
Well, anyway, the banks are right across the road. He saw this as the hot center of town. The better merchants had moved up there, and now he was up there. And he reopens his store. Temporarily has another partner, but not for long, as he resumes his practice of traveling a lot and buying merchandise. And soon he's reestablished himself as the largest merchant in the Black Hills. In fact, one newspaper story says by 1882, Miller receives more goods in 1 year than all the merchants in Rapid City did. Now, this is an ad from the 1882 New Year's edition. Now, if you do really silly research like I do, you look at the newspaper ads in the New Year's edition and you say, who's got the biggest ads? Well, Miller, that makes him the most important merchant, right? No. But Bullock and Starr had an ad just the same size. So in my mind, Bullock and Starr and Miller were the biggest merchants. But I put this up here because this is the kind of thing he would promote. J.K.P. Miller, wholesale and retail grocer. And he says up there, as complete an assortment of fine groceries as can be found in the United States, and the most elegantly furnished grocery store west of Chicago. And that's a lot of territory west of Chicago. So you've got a lot of brag rights. If you look, here's a list of the things he has. If you study that, he's big into canned goods. And he defends canned goods. And canned goods are kind of an iffy subject with Westerners or people. Not everybody accepts the fact that things you get out of a can are wholesome. But he says they're every bit as good and as wholesome as fresh. The bottom of the ad is an interesting telling point about Miller. He says, Thurber's number 34 roasted Rio coffee. He says, I guarantee it better than Arbuckle's Erosa. As historian Marshall Trimble says, very noted historian in Arizona, maybe you know Marshall, he writes, the West was won on coffee, not on whiskey, on coffee. And the number one drink was Arbuckle's. Everybody wanted Arbuckle's. But Miller didn't sell it. He was promoting Thurber's, who had their own line of coffee. Who were the Thurber's? They're the people that helped finance his operation. They underwrote his grocery shipments. They became friends at the time, Horace Thurber. In fact, Miller would have a daughter while in Deadwood, and he names his daughter Thurber Miller. So he gives her her first name, his last name. That's kind of a relationship they have. So he's promoting Thurber's and over Arbuckle's because that's his devotion. Well, but the rest of town, this is 1882, that ad appeared, is still struggling. He's doing well, but the town is struggling. He knows that has to be corrected. The town needs to be reinvigorated. So he starts getting much more engaged. And he gets involved with the Board of Trade. He and Bullock organize a Board of Trade. This is a picture of the Phoenix block built by McLaughlin right after the fire, hence rising from the flames. If you know Deadwood, you know that today is the Midnight Star. When Kevin Costner bought that building, when gaming started, he completely renovated it. Now Costner sold it and it's reopened as the Midnight Star. But that was the Phoenix block, and the top floor was a meeting room. And that's where the Board of Trade met. The Board of Trade said, what can we do to reinvigorate this town? Projects. What brings boom? Well, let's open a hotel. We need a first-class hotel. That means when money people come to town, they have someplace to stay. Let's build a free road to Spearfish. Every road into Deadwood was a toll road. They saw that as limiting their market. And they said, let's work with the people in Spearfish and build a free road over the hill to Spearfish. Spearfish people didn't want to play, so it never happened. Let's build a flour mill. They said, if we get a flour mill going, it'll be the center of new industrialization. They did. They built a flour mill. It didn't do worth a damn, but they had a flour mill. And Miller's big pet peeve were railroads. We need a railroad. Railroad will connect us to the world. Railroad will connect us to markets. Railroad will bring in the money people. And 1881, what's happening? The Homestake is building a railroad. The Black Hills and Fort Pierre, as it became known. And so Miller heads the committee. They go up to Lead and they talk to Samuel McMaster. They said, can you build to Central City, build to Deadwood? McMaster says, well, okay, it's an idea. I like it. I like it. I'll send it to the folks in California to see what they think. The people with the money, people to say so. And they waited. Miller waited. His committee waited, and they heard nothing. And as the railroad plunged deeper into the woods, 13, 14 miles south of Deadwood, they knew there was no chance the Black Hills and Fort Pierre were heading their way, much to their dismay. In fact, a little bit later, a suggestion was put out by somebody in the community. What do you say we go up to the Homestake and offer him $25,000 as an outright gift to build in? And he got the response, why grease an already fat pig? They didn't try to bribe the Homestake. Well, but having a railroad was always on their mind. Well, times were bad in Deadwood, and they got worse. In 1883, a flood came through. It didn't do quite the damage the fire did, but it still did $250,000 in damage. Miller lost only $2,500, but that's the back of Main Street off to the left, and it washed out the fireproof storage areas, the backs of the stores, as Whitewood Creek rampaged through town. Miller realized we got to do something about this, and he led a citizens committee that said we got to control the creek. And they started advocating building bulkheads, walls to contain the creek. And so they raised money. The city wouldn't do it. By then it was incorporated. They raised money as a citizens committee, and they built a 1,000-foot wall on the west side of the creek, back side of Main Street, and 16 feet high. And they backfilled, essentially raising parts of Deadwood, but to contain the creek. Eventually the creek, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, will be bulkheaded on both sides. But here's a more recent picture of the bulkhead along Main Street there, and the bulkhead on the other side during a high water event. And all the people have to gather to watch their bulkheads hold up. And it has held up. Deadwood hasn't had the flooding problem since they contained the creek like this. And now today, what serves as the bulkhead in Deadwood? The creek goes under the road. But I often wonder, it's in a big culvert under the road, a big thing, concrete thing. And I wonder if we have a real flood event and that concrete thing gets plugged, what's the town going to be like? Because they're going to have it someday. But I'm the outsider. I don't live there. But he had another hope. You know, we've had disaster, and he wants to get the mining regions to open. They haven't opened. And they can't get, but another railroad opportunity. And in 1885, the Fremont-Elkhorn Missouri Valley Railroad is building up towards Buffalo Gap in the southern part of the hills. And Miller says, wow, we need this railroad. So he takes a few guys with him, and they go to Fremont, Nebraska to talk to the hierarchy. They go to Chicago to talk to the big bosses. Are you building to Deadwood? You building to Deadwood? I said, yeah, we might build to Deadwood. We might. And Miller's inspired, and he goes back to town. We've got this railroad. It's a chance. And the Elkhorn will build on up towards Rapid City in 1886. Up there a little bit higher on the map. You all know where Rapid City is. But how do railroads play at this time in our history? They ask for money. They created a town of Buffalo Gap. They created the town of Fairburn. They created the town of Hermosa. Those are railroad towns, which they wanted to sell lots, make money, create shipping. And they get towards Rapid City and they say, you know, you guys are kind of tucked in the hills. We can pretty easily run around you and have our own new town. You know, Rapid City East, we'll call it. Some silly name like that. Unless you play with us. Come up with terms. And Rapid Cityans, as good community members, said, terms? What do you want? Land. Lots of land. Maybe under starry skies above. I'm sorry. We also want help with construction. Rapid Creek is pretty damn crooked. We want Rapid Creek straightened so you don't have to cross it. And you can see if you look at Rapid Creek, it comes in from the left and bends and bends and bends. Then once it gets to the heart of Rapid City and parallels the railroad tracks, it kind of straightens out until out to the east of Rapid City. They straightened the creek. They gave them land, ultimately worth over $40,000 of inducements. And what does the railroad promise? We'll stay there 1 year before we move on. And in 1886, after 1 year in Rapid, they built north. Before they built north, of course, they had a big ceremony in Rapid City, driving the last spike, big speeches. Miller was down there. Seth Bullock was down there. They cornered the railroad officials. They said, you're building to Deadwood? Oh, hell yes, we're building to Deadwood. And Miller goes back and tells the city council, he's on the city council then, we got to do nothing in our power to block them. In fact, we've got to offer them inducements. Look what Rapid City did. We've got to help them. We've got to inspire them. We've got to work with them. There's Miller giving that speech. That's supposed to be the speech I gave when I'm looking at Miller's face. Well, what does they do? The city does get inspired. And they decide, okay, let's build our own reduction works. We'll make Deadwood an ore processing center and build a plant that can process that ore from those districts that lay around Deadwood, just not on the home state. That area, those mining districts I pointed out, the Ruby Basin, the Bald Mountain, they have difficult ore, hard ore to treat. Well, let's build a plant that can treat it, and they call it the Deadwood Reductions Plant. And the Board of Trade gets together to do that. And so they're starting to make improvements that will help prosper the town, particularly when the railroad gets there. Miller takes something, the next step for his own investment, but it's just not for his own. If he can bring money to himself, make himself wealthy, he can also make the town wealthy. He organizes an investment group he calls the Syndicate. And this is the biggest syndicate member, Joseph Swift. William, his brother, is also in it, but not nearly as big as Joseph. Joseph was the vice president of Diamond Match. His brother, William Swift, was president of Diamond Match. In the 1880s, 1890s, if you bought a match, the early 20th century, who did you buy it from? Diamond Match. They had an absolute monopoly on matches, kitchen matches. So Joseph Swift comes to Deadwood and starts investing in programs and projects that Miller has promoted to him. Miller met him when he travels back east, and he promotes Deadwood, and Joseph Swift says, okay, if I buy into Deadwood, the property will go up, my investment will succeed, and I'll make more money. And that's the nuance into the syndicate. Buy property in Deadwood, and you'll do better. As money with the syndicate, they do a variety of projects, hoping the railroad will come in, Elkhorn, Fremont, Elkhorn, Missouri Valley, hoping things will get better. They built a syndicate block in 1888. They built a street railway. Here's part of the railway car in 1888. The street railway ran for 1 1/4 mile. You can walk that, can't you? Even I'm old and I can handle it. You know, you don't need a street railway in Deadwood. Now they have the trolleys, I guess, but that's whatever. But what it was for show. Part of it, you know, to make Deadwood look metropolitan. Any kind of urban center that wanted to be an urban center had a street railway. For gosh sake, Sioux Falls had one. Rapid City had one. Even Cheyenne, Wyoming had one, of all places in the world. But anyway, so Pierre had one. So now Deadwood had a street railway, thanks to syndicate money. He left the grocery business behind, and he goes into real estate, selling real estate to his syndicate members, and he gets into the railroad business, the DCRR, the Deadwood Central Railroad. He and his syndicate members incorporate their own railroad. Here they are surveying. The surveyors are out looking for the route. His railroad stakes right-of-ways up every gulch in the Black Hills and northern Black Hills. 344 miles they project. They never build more than 20 miles. But most importantly, they build the line to Lead, first thing. But they also want to build to the mining regions just on the other side of Lead to bring that ore down to Deadwood and the processing plant. And here's a picture of the early Deadwood Central. Now, the slope between Deadwood and Lead is pretty steep, but this is a slight exaggeration. So that would be a definite runaway. And he opens the Deadwood Central. So he's got a railroad. And it's at this point the paper's looking at everything Miller's done. The syndicate block, the railroad, property prices are rising up. His syndicate members have invested in the processing plant. And this is where the paper calls him the Savior of Deadwood. Because they see the boom coming because Miller has brought it with his projects. The Elkhorn hasn't arrived yet. And where was the Elkhorn through all of this? This is Whitewood, as it says. The railroad got there in 1887, and Deadwood expected it to build right in. The Elkhorn didn't. At Whitewood, 10 miles from Deadwood, they didn't need to move. They had all the business cornered at Whitewood. If you wanted to ship by rail, you went to Whitewood. And from 1887 to 1890, Whitewood was a shipping mecca. Cattle pens, transfer docks, loading stations, had hotels. It was a booming little burg. That was a railroad town. And as the railroad didn't budge, Miller became more frustrated. The people in Deadwood became more frustrated. Why doesn't the Elkhorn build in? And Miller becomes damn angry. On top of that, on March 1st, 1889, this reduction works, this plant they were building to process the ore, burns mysteriously. It was arson. The guy that built it burned it. The thing didn't work. Back in the Old West, when you sell a process to somebody who was gullible enough to buy it and you want to hide that it was a failure, what do? You burn it. Then you leave. And that was standard in the West, and Deadwood got sucked into it. So there, again, another slap on the face in 1889. It was an ugly time. But Miller had invested big money in Deadwood. His syndicate had invested money. They had to do something. What did they do? They said, we're going to build our own reduction plant, our own ore processing plant. And they build a small smelter. They hire the first dean from the School of Mines, a guy named Franklin Carpenter, to start working on a process where he melts the ore and gets the gold out. And this is a small trial plant in Lower Deadwood. And okay, it's kind of iffy, kind of works, but it really needs a railroad to haul the coal and the other things to it. It needs an outside connection. And Miller's trying to take care of that. By 1889, the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad is building up to the southern tip of the hills, heading to Newcastle, Wyoming, and Cambria. It wants the coal in Cambria. And it's dusting by the tip of the hills. And Miller says, the Elkhorn won't build. He knows these two railroads are arch rivals, the Burlington and the Elkhorn. And he goes to Boston and talks to the Burlington people. Build to Deadwood. Build up through the hills. There's tin at Hill City. There's gold in Deadwood. And I'll work with you. I'll buy you property. You have to buy it from me, but I'll get you the property. I'll sell you parts of the Deadwood Central. I'll do everything in my power to make you succeed. Plus, you'll beat the Elkhorn to Deadwood. Burlington agrees. And they start building a line, the Black Hills line, up from Edgemont to the heart of the hills towards Deadwood. A picture from 1890, just north of Custer, at a place called Horseshoe Curve, laying rails, heading towards Deadwood. And well, the Elkhorn sees this, and they've had a monopoly for 3 years on the rail traffic. And they don't want to lose that monopoly. So quickly, they start building in from Whitewood to Deadwood. Now, Burlington had 106 miles to build, the Elkhorn 10 miles. And it was called a railroad race. Well, it sounds like an unfair race if you ask me. But of course, the Elkhorn would prevail. But it wasn't easy. This picture is a little bit those are gold mills that would be built in Deadwood thanks to the rival railroads. But here's the Elkhorn coming into Lower Deadwood up Whitewood Creek. Now, it wasn't easy because Miller, Swift, and the Burlington owned all that land. They bought it. And now the Elkhorn won a right-of-way. And those players said no. And massive litigation after litigation went on. The Elkhorn wanted to build much further to the other side of the gulch. And in an ultimate compromise, this was as close to the plant as you could get with their main line swooping along the side. After much litigation and fight, what the paper called a spice of war. But building through town was another story. Even there, the Swift and the syndicate had a stronger lock on the property. And they weren't going to let the Elkhorn come through. They weren't going to let the Elkhorn take competition away from the Deadwood Central or the Burlington. Saul Starr is mayor. Saul Starr is big friends with the Elkhorn Railroad. Why is he suddenly a big bud of the Elkhorns? Because he wants them to build to the Star and Bullock Ranch north, and he wants the new town of Belfouche formed. So they say, okay, we'll build to your ranch if you help us get through Deadwood. He's mayor. Miller's on the council. The council's divided. Miller for Starr, and it's an ugly fight. Miller's doing everything in his power to block the railroad, and boy, it's Saul Starr comes with all kinds of ideas how to get the railroad through. And Miller says he's going to ruin the town. He calls him all kinds of names. It was just a public fight. And one of Saul Starr's henchmen, if you will, says, all Miller wants is to turn this into Millerville. And so it's a great fight. It's a true railroad war in Deadwood. And ultimately, they do come to a compromise, and Elkhorn actually gets to build through Deadwood to the mining regions beyond. What they do is they promise to build another bulkhead. That one bulkhead was built after the flood, and they build the bulkhead on the other side of the creek there while keeping appropriate sized channel. The channel width was a big part of the fight for the creek, and they build their track on top. This is the Elkhorn, that's the Burlington. The Elkhorn arrives December 29th, 1890 in Deadwood. The Burlington, January 14th, 1891. That's a big day in Deadwood. The railroads arrived, and everything seems to boom from there. Boom has come to Deadwood. The syndicate members have had success with their smelter. They start building a larger smelter in Lower Deadwood, ultimately getting to the big one we saw at the beginning. And they call it the Deadwood and Delaware smelter because Joseph and William Swift, the big money men behind it, are from Wilmington, Delaware. The Deadwood and Delaware smelter. All of Deadwood booms. And here's the smelter on the left. Up the gulch is the Golden Reward chlorination plant. That was started by Harris Franklin and his associates, including Edward Harriman of the Union Pacific fame and financial circles. Fine, he has money in it. The Consolidated Mill, the Imperial Mill, all in Lower Deadwood, inspired by this early gold success of the syndicate and by the railroads bringing ore in. And Deadwood booms. We get the modern Deadwood we see. The Franklin Hotel goes up in 1903. The bank next to it, right there across the Shine Street next to it, has sandstone and marble in it. Could only be brought in by railroads. So modern Deadwood blossoms because of these railroads and the boom that comes to Deadwood. But our hero, our protagonist of our story, doesn't see it. Just days before the Burlington arrives in Deadwood, he dies. He'd been sick. In fact, in one of the big fights in city council, he's brought to the council on a bed, carried in by his supporters. And then as soon as the decision's been made, he goes to California to try to recoup, and he dies in California. At this time, he's married to Mary Cumsomero, the daughter of Judge Cumsomero and Helena. So she takes him to the family plot in Helena. So he's buried in Helena, in the Cumsomero plot, also shared by the Broadwaters, those people he met many years ago in Helena. But the syndicate would carry on. He has avid employees helping him, and Joseph Swift would, in the end, make money there. Not all syndicate members made money, but several did do well, thanks to Miller. When Miller died, the paper said this. I should read these eulogies, I guess. The pioneer, the Deadwood Daily Pioneer, no death that has ever happened in the community has caused the general regret as that of Mr. Miller's. The Black Hills Daily Times. To J.K.P. Miller, more than any other man, Deadwood owes its present season of unequaled prosperity. And the Engineering and Mining Journal said, it is said that to his individual efforts is due the construction of the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad and the Fremont Elkhorn, Missouri Valley Railroad to Deadwood. The irony is syndicate members made money, railroads made money, Deadwood would boom thanks to him, but he died massively in debt. He had borrowed money right and left to leverage what he was trying to do, thinking he would be able to pay it off as he got wealthy. He couldn't. His wife was hounded by litigation for the next 30 years. In fact, Horace Thurber, their dear friend, was one of the huge litigants after her, and she promptly changed the name of her daughter from Thurber to Mary. And so it's a sad story in the end that he dies so much in debt. So this is the story that's outlined in the Savior of Deadwood, how he brought the railroads in, the gold plants, and all it's really a lot about Deadwood. Because he was only in Deadwood 15 years, I realized I could write the story in 90 pages, which I did. But my dear friend Nancy Copel, who used to be director of the press and peer, said, David, it's a great story. Put Deadwood in the story too. So easily half the book is about Deadwood, about the events in Deadwood, about violence in Deadwood, about Indian wars around Deadwood. And that's why a 90-some page essay just about Miller came to be 200 and some pages. So it's a way to look at Deadwood, and it's really a way to look at how Deadwood looks through a middle-class merchant, and how a middle-class merchant survives in Deadwood, and what promotion and speculation went on. We in history of the West, you hear about promoters and speculators, but the Black Hills have never been written about in those terms. Well, he was one, and he was successful and good at it, and so it's partly that story as well. Well, that ends my presentation. I'll be happy to entertain any questions, and I thank you for your attention. Yes, Bob.
Rockefeller.
Yeah.
Did he move to Deadwood?
No, not this. John moved. In fact, soon after Miller left Virginia City, Rockefeller will die. So when he decides to go up to Helena, part of the reason is, well, Rockefeller's dead. So now there was a number of Rockefellers around. It's a name you don't hear anymore today, but it was kind of prevalent in the West.
There was a Hamilton Rockfellow who did a stationery and bookstore in Deadwood.
Oh, was there?
And that Rockfellow is Hamilton, not unusual, but
Rockfellow is, yes, I agree. Any other questions?
Is that Burlington line now the Mixon Trail?
That's correct. And it's a great to be able to be on the Mixon Trail and think about Miller and the railroad construction. And it's interesting too, if you go to Englewood and you bike towards Lee, you know how it loops up. That's the old Black Hills Fort Pierre line that the Homestake put in. So you leave the Burlington, you go on the Black Hills Fort Pierre. They were put in 1881, abandoned in 1930. Then, of course, the Burlington was abandoned in 1983, and the Mixon Trail was put in a few years thereafter. But, do you have a question, sir?
Well, I don't think I can ask you very well. A little confused just in that I understand with the mining, you have miners, you need to have all kinds of supplies, and usually in these mining communities, the guys that sell the shovels make all the money, very few people make it. And so there's a need to bring goods in, and I just don't know the answer to this, but refined gold, does it really require a railroad to take the...
What they only need the railroad for in their gold process when they built the smelter was to haul coal in. Coal and coke. And that was a major commodity. And part of what Miller could sell to the Burlington about building in was, you've got the coal mines. I'm going to build a smelter that's going to use a heck of a lot of it. So we have a natural market for your railroad. So that was the product. The coal, hauling the coal in. Yeah, once you refine coal.
Because there's not much export.
No, they have an express car. In fact, the Homestake started shipping out by railroad, and they have one express car, a week, I think it was. And I know they were shipping out express cars out of Deadwood, probably the same express car once a week. So yeah, very limited. But the supplies and the coal particularly. Yes.
We have a question from a listener at home and also a comment thanking you for your presentation and your time. The question is, what is your favorite historical site in South Dakota as it relates to your research?
My favorite site is related to my research. Oh, that's a tough one. You know, there's so many in the hills. People talk about having a favorite site, and I haven't been able to pinpoint one, but they kind of shift. You know, it's kind of variable. And right now, I guess I like going to the Terry Cemetery. The town of Terry, of course, was dug up in the modern gold rush, but you know, several thousand people lived there once, and now the gulch is kind of reclaimed. The cemetery remains, and I like to sit there and think about what Terry was about, and talk about Terry in groups. And of course, that's where Calamity Jane died, which has nothing to do with historical relevance, but she still died there. But it's in the heart of my favorite part of the hills, the Ruby Basin District. And I love the Ruby Basin District. When I worked and lived in the hills in 85 to 86, when I was opened a pharmacy there, I was a pharmacist. And my last gasp of pharmacy, unsuccessfully running. I was like Miller, I couldn't run a damn business. But anyway, that was before they dug it up. If you go up to this mine district, you can see all the open shafts and the adits. Fascinating. Just loved it. And now it's all been dug up, and what hasn't been dug up is fenced off. But I can still go up there and think about those days that I just loved hiking through that mining district and all the memories and the great stories. And I got interested in mining. I'm a mining historian at heart, and luckily he's tied to mining. And it's not because of, well, I like to study human greed, I guess, but it's about the human endeavor. You think about it when you go to a ghost town, or you go to any place like Lee, they're on these hillsides, they're digging in the dirt, and the homestead 8,000 feet deep for this damn metal. And it's just exciting stuff. Human endeavor, compelled by human greed. And it brought the worst out in people sometimes. And those are the kind of historical stories that are fun. So if anybody's interested in a copy, they're listed at $29.95, but I'll sell them for $25. The Bullock book, if you haven't ever bought, those are listed like $19.95. I'll sell you one of those for $15. So I'll sell you one of each for $40. That adds up, doesn't it? No, a bargain, 2 for 1, $35, $5 off. No, I don't mean to sell. If you're interested.
Any other questions?
Are you going to be presenting at the festival?
Yeah, I've talked to Jennifer at the Humanities Council, and I'll be at the festival. You going to the festival?
Yeah.
It's always lots of fun, isn't it? You know, so, and I'm not really good in the virtual world, obviously, tell here, but so I didn't pay a lot of attention to the festival last year, but the year before when I was in Deadwood, I had a hoot. You know, I emceed some sessions and I had lots of friends there, and it's a joy. So maybe I'll bump into you. I have asked to be on some panels about Deadwood. Funny thing. Anything else? Well, thank you. Yes, sir.
What kind of dog? I saw a dog by him.
You know, he referenced the dog in his diary. Oh, that's a good, and I forgot if he identified what type of dog it was. I don't know. I can't answer that. But he does talk about his dog briefly in the diary. Now, this is an interesting story. He kept a diary from the day he left New York and he went to Montana. Every day, not quite every day, he wrote something down. And he did that until a couple of years before he left Deer Lodge. That's a great, source. But there's nothing after that. And I can't help but believe a guy that kept a diary for 8 years quits. Yeah. So this library is held at the Bancroft. I've contacted Bancroft several times. Oh, that's it. That's all we have. I've contacted Montana Historical Society because they lots of this stuff or have some of this stuff. Oh, no. And I have a friend in Spearfish who knew, well, I kind of knew him too, the grandson, James K.T. Miller III, and he's quite elderly. Anything about your dad's or grandpa's diary? He said, no diary. So it's been so nice. Luckily, Miller was such a public man as far as what he did. The newspapers carried him a lot. And thank goodness for digitization newspapers. Praise me. Okay. Sorry about no dogs. Sorry.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Thank you.